All right. Hey, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. We're getting started just a little bit late. We got a few things we need to set up. For those of you that might not have gotten some food, we have some more on the way. We'll take a break a little way through, and we'll make sure that you guys get fed. We got several sandwiches still coming, so thank you for your patience with that. I'm really excited for tonight's session. If you've been with us for a while, you know that this is our third session. We talked about the biology of the brain. We talked about poverty in the brain. And tonight we're talking about the trauma of foster care. If you remember when we talked about the brain, we talked a little bit about trauma. Tonight we're going to look specifically about the kind of trauma that's experienced through the foster care system and how we as a church can be prepared to both work with the foster care system, work with biological families, and also welcome foster kids into our gatherings and into all of our various services. So I'm really excited to have Magel. Megan has been a great partner in the ministry. She's previously been working for Project 127, which is a faith-based foster care organization that recruits foster parents, trains them, and sends them on to the agencies. We have a great partnership with Project 127. Just last month, we got to help to put on their annual picnic, which was a great time. Thank you to several of you that were able to be there and serve at that. Megan is a counselor for All Health. She's been working with the foster care community as a caseworker for a long time and just has a wealth of knowledge. So we're excited to have Megan Magel with us tonight.
Thank you. All right, well, is this working pretty well, or should I move it? Okay. All right, perfect. All right, so I am Megan, and I'm really excited to be here with you tonight. Mark did a great job kind of introing some of the things that I've done. But just to give you another quick recap, so I did most recently come from Project 127, and it's a great opportunity to kind of get started with foster care. Sometimes you come in with wide eyes thinking, I want to help, I want to serve kids and families in crisis, but not really sure where to start. And so Project 127 is a great place to kind of get pointed in some different directions with some good support and with faith-based training. So it's really a great program. But prior to that, I actually started out when I was 21 years old working in a residential treatment center. So some people are excited to start drinking when they turn 21, and I was excited to start working in residential treatment with teenagers. I just was thinking that this is exactly what I want to do. This is what God has made me for. He made me looking really young, so that way teenagers would like me and feel like I'm relatable. I just really felt like it was what my calling was, and so I started working in residential. And it was a really intense experience. I was brought up in a Christian family that was pretty protected from a lot of different challenges that some folks face. And so for me to go into residential treatment and learn about some of the things that happen to kids and things that have happened to their family members, it was very eye-opening, and in a lot of ways shook me to my core and really had me look deeper into my faith and who is God and what does He allow, the things that He allows, and that kind of thing. So it was a really formative time for me. I went on then from undergrad and got my master's degree in counseling from Denver Seminary and continued to work in residential treatment while I was here in Colorado. Then after a while, I took a break, and I worked at a place called Kaya House, which is with Open Door Ministries. I don't know if any of you have heard of them. They're down on Colfax and Marion downtown. And so I was able to work with women who were coming out of homelessness and coming out of different crisis situations. So women who had experienced domestic violence, women who had pretty severe mental health issues, women who are wrestling with addictions, those kinds of things. And so I really was able to develop a heart for these women and see these women are really just a lot of these kids that I was working with in residential 10 or 15 years or more down the road, that they were kind of coming with the same trauma issues, that they were wrestling with some of the same things. Many of them didn't have families who were supportive to them, and so they weren't able to get treatment and get help for some of these things that they struggled with. Many of them didn't have those connections to family members because of their own family members' mental health and unhealthy situations. And so I really consider that time beneficial to me because working in foster care, you hear about biological parents, but you don't always know their backstory. And so for me to be able to develop that time of learning these women well and having such a heart for them, it was a great time in my career. And then I decided that I was going to work for Jefferson County Human Services, which was kind of a slap to the face, working for, kind of a government agency after being at this small nonprofit where it was all about the people that you serve, then working for the county where you kind of became the enemy in a lot of ways, because I'm used to aligning with families and aligning with clients, and now all of a sudden they hated me because I represented the system. So, but it was interesting to be able to see the inner workings and how a lot of times the county has good intentions, but the way that things play out really are hard for families, hard for foster families, just kind of hard for everybody involved. And it goes back to even the reason why Project 127 started is because Robert Gelinas over at Colorado Community Church said it's really the church's role to take care of kids and families who are broken and who are hurting. And because we haven't done a good job with that, we need to have these government systems in place taking care of kids and families. And so I thought, what a great way to think about it, that this is really what we're called to do as the church, is to reach out to families who are in crisis and struggling, and to help support kids who are in situations where there's crisis. That's really the role of the church. And so the more we can be involved with that on the front end, or how we can be involved with that as the system is involved, the better the situation. So now, currently, I am at All Health Network. I'm a therapist there, and able to see all different kinds of folks with Medicaid, and so it's been a joy for me to be able to kind of see different people that I hadn't been able to see before, because it's hard to get on with Medicaid. But one of the things I want to start out with before we get into really unpacking some of this material is there's a film called Removed. How many of you have seen this before? Okay, so it's pretty difficult to watch. I just want to give that disclaimer. It's a very emotionally intense video that just shows the experience of a girl who is in a home where there's a lot of different things going on, and ends up being removed and going into the foster care system. So if you feel like it's a little bit too emotionally intense for you, please feel free to step out and kind of wait it out. It's about 12 minutes long, but I think that it's really helpful in kind of setting the tone for the things that we're going to be talking about here tonight. So we're going to take the time to watch it now. I always find it difficult to transition after watching that video. There's just no way that you can attend to just the emotion, the heartbreak, all of the different things that come up when you're watching that film. The reason why I think it's important, though, is because it gives face and character and personality to the things that we're going to be talking about. Because a lot of times when we think about foster care, it's just kind of this looming cloud, right? It's just overwhelming, a lot of questions, a lot of unknown. And so for us to be able to picture some folks who are involved in it and what they have to experience, I think that is helpful to give us more perspective as we talk about it. So we talked a little bit about why engage, and we watched the video to say this is why we engage in this conversation. This is why it's important. This is why Mark and Chas are so passionate about sharing about foster care all over Denver. And so we really want to think about the point of the church and what we can do to help in this kind of situation. With the biological parents, I talked a little bit about this in terms of working downtown and getting a chance to really experience some of these women who had their children placed in foster care. And for some of the women, their rights had been terminated from caring for their kids. And that's a really serious thing. I don't know if you know this, but when their rights are terminated from their parents, the court deems that a termination of parental rights will take place. The biological parents' names are literally removed from the birth certificate. And to me, the power of that, the heartbreak that comes along with that, is something that we need to be paying attention to, because that is so significant in what that communicates to the biological parents. That I think as we watch that film, we see the mother and we see her, maybe not taking things seriously, or chasing after the father instead of chasing after the kids when the police come. And so our minds maybe go to thinking about why would she do something like this, or making judgments about her. But one of the things I want us to just kind of take a second to reflect upon, and I want you to also flag this page for when we have discussion so that you can come back and have some table discussion around this. But thinking about what have the biological parents experienced? Were they, as I was mentioning before, were they also in foster care? Did they experience abuse and neglect in their life? Are they in a domestic violence situation or a situation of addiction where we know that their mind is literally taken over by substances, or preoccupied in this relationship where they're feeling loved and validated, even though from the outside we see that there's dysfunction and harm? What are their barriers? Are they struggling with severe mental health issues? When parents have their children removed from them, they're given really a short period of time to make some significant life changes. Really, within a year, the counties are looking at parents to be sober from drugs and alcohol for significant amounts of time, for them to find sustainable housing, which maybe is something they've never had before, to leave relationships of domestic violence that have been their only lifeline because they're disconnected from their other family members. So we're asking them to take these huge leaps. And so maybe it's easy for us on the outside to kind of think one thing or another about biological parents, but it's really important for us, again, to take that step back and to have that perspective and that empathy as to what it is that they may be experiencing in their lives that is preventing them from being able to parent the way that they want to parent. And working with the women downtown, many of them, as I was working with them, they were gaining sobriety. They were starting employment. They were looking at sustainable housing. And they were grieving because they said, why couldn't I have done this when my child was in the system so that I could still have my child living with me? That a lot of times these family members, years later, when they are able to achieve those milestones of sobriety and all of the other factors in place, they grieve because they've missed the opportunity to have their children with them, which, as we can imagine, is the most painful thing that a human can imagine. Are they doing the best with what they can and with what they have? That's not really for us to decide. That's really up to the Lord. And what we're called to do is to be available and to be supportive and to be loving and try to see them the way that Christ sees them. For kids in care, we know that they're coming with significant challenges as well. We know that there's a strong genetic component, as we're talking about mental health, as that's part of your series, is looking at the genetic component of mental health issues. That many mental health diagnoses such as ADHD, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, that they have a highly significant genetic component to them. And so there's tendencies then for these kids, if their parents have struggled with them, for them to struggle as well. Whether it's later on in life, schizophrenia is usually a later onset, about age 18. You may start seeing symptoms of that emerge. But we know that parents have struggled with those things, and that's part of the reason that kids are now in care, is because of their mental health issues, whether they're diagnosed and treated or not. And so the kids a lot of times are struggling with some of these issues as well. We also know that enduring stress and trauma, that those things can change the neurochemistry in our brains. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I think that in the first session when you were talking about the brain and trauma, you were able to talk about that and the fact that there are actual physical altercations that are made to the brain in situations of trauma. And so we have expectations for folks to move on and to get over things, but really we have to take a step back, again with empathy, to understand that there's deeper things going on here, that there's really powerful forces at play that take a while. We're thankful that God gave us brains that are plastic and that are able to change and grow with treatment and the ability to heal and be restored. But it's a difficult process, and there's a lot of pain along the way. What we're going to talk about next is how the lack of attachment can also look like mental health disorders. I think that the video is also helpful in just kind of showing what are some of these different behaviors that sometimes we see from kids in foster care, or we hear stories about kids. And so we start thinking, oh, these are rough kids, right? But as we take, again, a step back and look at how does attachment affect kids and their behaviors and their mental health and their brain chemistry, we can see again that it does require us to step in with a perspective of empathy because of the ways that they are altered from the things that they experience. So looking here at the attachment cycle, this is from what's called trust-based relational intervention, TBRI. And Dr. Karen Purvis and Dr. David Cross out of Texas Christian University have created this model to really look at how do we parent kids who've experienced trauma. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, I'm a practitioner. There's also a lot of different trainings you can go to around Denver, primarily through Adoption Exchange, to learn more about this method of parenting, which I think is really helpful. As we look at the attachment cycle, and this is in your notes, so if you'd like to follow along, if this is a little bit too small for you and you'd like something a little closer to your face, I'm sure that that would be helpful. But just kind of talking about the beginning, that in attachment, when we think of particularly little babies, right, we think that they express a need. We hear them express a need through crying, right, that they want to be held, they need to be fed, they're tired. We hear these needs and they're crying, they're experiencing this distress, and so as caregivers, we step in and we meet this need. And as we comfort them, then we can see in these other systems that they calm down. So before, when they were distressed, their heart rate was elevated, their blood pressure was elevated. You know, all of those things that when we're feeling panic, that our bodies do to have that fight, flight, freeze response, right? The way that, that God intended, that we're preparing ourselves to meet our survival needs. And in terms of neurotransmitters, that we've got neurotransmitters, again, that are gearing us up to take action because we need to have those needs met. But as babies, we're not able to meet our own needs, and so we need that caregiver to step in and meet that need and comfort us. So when they comfort us, then we're able to calm down. Our heart rate goes down, our blood pressure goes down. All of those different neurotransmitters are starting to release now, the serotonin and the GABA that help give us that calming feeling that washes over our bodies. And so we need the completion of the cycle in order to really be able to develop as God intended for us, that when we're experiencing something difficult, we can then calm down because we've experienced that before through the caregiving and the nurturing that we receive when we're little. But unfortunately for some folks, and again, going back to the biological parents, we're not sure what their barriers are, but for whatever reason, they were not able to meet the needs of the child. And this isn't, you know, consistent in every single case, but this is just kind of this generalization for some of these kids, that if their needs are not met, particularly when they're infants and they're really relying on caregivers, then they stay in this constant cycle of distress. And their bodies literally don't learn how to calm down because they are consistently feeling that fight, flight, or freeze, unsure of whether or not somebody is going to come and take care of them, and a lot of times get convinced to the point that nobody is going to come and take care of them. Learning about attachment, one of the things that they talk about is situations like overseas and places we think of like Eastern Europe where there's orphanages. And in these rooms full of babies, you walk in expecting to hear all of these babies crying, right? Because that's kind of what we're used to hearing when we're around babies. But you go into these rooms and orphanages and the babies aren't crying. It's silent. And the reason it's silent is because they've learned that it doesn't matter if I cry, that no one will come for me. And they learn this, even though they're not in a cognitive place where they can logically work it out. Their little bodies take that on to understand that it doesn't matter if I cry or not. And we've learned through studies as well that even though they're not verbally crying, that they're not visibly upset, that they still are experiencing the same increased blood pressure, the same increased heart rate, because their little bodies are in that fight, flight, or freeze mode, because they are trying to figure out, how do I get my needs met? How do I survive? And so if you look down at the bottom, and again, this is probably harder to read on the screen, it talks about trajectory of mental illness. And when I show this slide, I want folks to know this isn't like this inevitable fate of what could happen, but it's just saying that when a child is in a consistent state of distress, these are some of the different things that we see, right? These are some of the different symptoms that appear. That we see this behavioral dysregulation in 2 to 3-year-olds. So as we're used to our 2 and 3-year-olds melting down, this is taking it up to a whole nother level where they're not able to calm down, they're not able to self-soothe because, again, they're not used to completing that cycle. And so their little bodies don't know how to do that. And so they stay in that state of tantrum for significant amounts of time before they do eventually stop. We see ADHD symptoms, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Anxiety, depression, things that look like bipolar. And so these may not be actual mental health issues that they have, but they're showing symptoms of it. They're showing really similar commonalities because of the lack of attachment and the ways that their bodies stay in distress. But because we're talking about neurotransmitters, that's what medication helps with, right? And so if somebody's depressed, then they might take a medication that helps with serotonin. And so in these situations, medications can be beneficial because we know that there is that brain chemistry level. But that's not the holistic healing that we're looking for folks, right? Because we know that we might be able to mitigate some of these symptoms with medications, but that's not bringing about what we want in terms of God really redeeming and restoring and bringing this child back onto the developmental trajectory that He's intended for them. So looking at the overlap between, for example, ADHD and trauma, that when we see these kids, we're seeing them in school, we're seeing them in Sunday school. If you've got foster children in your home or a child who's experienced trauma in your home, you're seeing some of this difficulty concentrating, that they're easily distracted. They don't seem to listen. They seem disorganized. They're hyperactive. They might be aggressive. They're restless, and maybe they have a difficult time sleeping. Maybe I'm also describing children in your home who have not been through foster care or experienced trauma. So what we're talking about is an elevated level, right? We're talking about something that's more significant than a neurotypical child. But because of this overlap, a lot of times these children then are diagnosed with ADHD or with other mental health issues when really we're looking at trauma and how trauma has impacted them. That they're having a hard time concentrating because their minds are, again, still stuck in that fight, flight, or freeze. They're not sure where their next meal is coming from. Even if you have a kitchen full of food, that their little minds are wired to think, I don't know if there's going to be enough food. And it might take a lifetime for them to get to a place where they feel comfortable knowing that there is enough food that's available to them. Okay? Or it could be that because they've experienced violence around them, there's something called hypervigilant, where they're constantly looking to see if they're going to be safe, that they've got to be looking over their back and aware of all the different surroundings because they don't know if they're safe, and so they're keeping an eye out. And so this may look like, again, that they're hyperactive, that they're too distracted, they're not paying attention and focusing to school or when I ask them to do something. And so again, we go back and we think about how has trauma impacted these kids and how can I take an empathetic response and how can I look at helping to treat their trauma in addition to just their symptoms. So we're going to kind of go over these more quickly. We're not going to take a whole lot of time to dive into them. We will have a little bit of time for question and answers at the end, so if you'd like to ask more questions, please feel free to do so. But we're going to just kind of go through them. But I wanted these different diagnoses to be familiar to you because these are the ones that kids who have experienced trauma or in foster care typically receive as they're going through the process, as they go through counseling, IEPs, the independent education plans, that kind of thing. So again, we see the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I wrote out all of the names because I know acronyms can get to be a little bit much. Anxiety, depression, bipolar. One that you may not have heard of is oppositional defiant disorder, and we'll break that one down a little bit. Similarly, reactive attachment disorder is one that is not as common that people hear about. One that's newer is the disinhibited social engagement disorder. And then sensory processing disorders are more likely to take place for kids who've experienced trauma as well. So for reactive attachment disorder, these are kids who have experienced that break in that attachment cycle that we talked about. And so when you meet with them, these kids kind of seem to be kind of checked out. As you look at them, their affect is pretty flat, that they don't seem to be very responsive and engaging, that they're not really showing evidence of joy very often. And that it has to really do with this fact that they didn't have that support from families, that they didn't feel that trust as a young child. And so because of that, they've learned to put up a wall to protect themselves and to push away. And this can be a really difficult thing, as you can imagine, as you're a caregiver who's now trying to pour love on and pour more and more love onto this child, and to show them and teach them about being in a family where that's just a part of the culture, is this loving interaction. And these kids are going to react against that they're going to have a very difficult time with receiving that kind of love and support. So this is actually kind of a controversial disorder diagnosis. And the reason for that is because some people feel like, well, that's really not fair to label these kids who've experienced severe trauma, that this is really complex trauma, and we don't want to put them, in a box or a category. So my personal opinion about diagnosis is that it can really be helpful in a lot of ways. It can be helpful because it helps normalize your experience, right? When you read, oh yeah, this is actually what my child is experiencing, then maybe you'll feel like now there are some other supports, there are some other interventions, some common language that we can use to meet the child's needs, as opposed to feeling isolated and alone because this is also unfamiliar and so different from other experiences with other children or with friends' children. And so I think that it's helpful for that reason. I just wanted to point out too, if this is something that you feel like your child may have, or you may know somebody and you're seeing some of these things in their child, there's actually a really great group here in Denver, and they're called the RAD Advocates. If you want to write that down, to use them as a resource. And what these folks do is they're actually parents of kids who have RAD. And so they've kind of gone through this journey of what is it like to love this child and to fight so hard for them and have this child be pushing away from them and not receiving the love that they're trying to pour out on them. And so they're able to kind of help navigate with parents. How does that look for if the child needs to go into residential treatment because the child is not working in the home because they don't want to be around the parents. They can't maintain that kind of attachment. So they help navigate a lot of these different situations that you may find yourself in if you have a child who is struggling with this. A more recent diagnosis that's now in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health, it talks about these kids then who they actually do really well with other adults, just not caregivers, okay? And so you can again see how this plays into that attachment issue, right? Because they couldn't trust their caregivers. And so now when they have foster parents or people who are trying to be in a parental role, these kids are pushing against them because they feel unsafe. It brings up all of those issues that they have with the lack of care that they received or the violence that they received as young children. But if they're around other adults or other people socially, that they're able to manage just fine. And so these are the kids that when you are in a residential or group home setting, they actually function really well because it feels more institutional. It doesn't feel like a home setting. And they actually thrive and do a lot better because they're not facing that parental dynamic. Oppositional defiant disorder, I told you I would mention this one. And the reason is because I think that there are a lot of kids, particularly kids who've experienced trauma, who end up with this kind of diagnosis. And so as you read through it, and I won't read it aloud, but as you read through it, you probably think, well, this is every teenager that I've met, right? So we can just label them all as oppositional defiant. But I want to let you know that this is actually pretty uncommon, all right? So as I worked in the juvenile delinquency unit over at Jeffco, there was actually very few kids, even though they were in trouble with the law, even though they were incredibly disrespectful to their parents and adults, that would actually receive this kind of diagnosis. So there was one girl that I was meeting with in private practice, and her parents said, oh yeah, she's oppositional defiant disorder. And as it turns out, she was willing to email her therapist. Actually, she had a quicker response time than her parents did. She was a part of the debate team and sat through therapy and carried on conversation. And I said, this is not a child who is oppositional defiant, okay? So there could be some kind of relational dynamic between parents and child, but ultimately this is the kind of kid who, in regardless of what setting, is going to be arguing with the authority figure in a very aggressive and manipulative and vindictive kind of way. Yeah, go ahead.
Are you going to discuss how you treat this or how you handle kids with it, or are you just throwing it out there and that's a topic for you?
So for this evening, I would love to be able to present to you all the different ways to interact with this, but because of time, I'm not going to be able to get into the inner workings of it. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry to not be able to give you the answers this evening. But I did want to just get this information out to you of things that you can experience, and so it sounds more familiar to you as you're working with foster and adoptive families. I think as we talk about all of these different kinds of disorders, we look at obviously parents who are attentive to them and understanding for kids who've experienced these difficult things in their lives. Sometimes we call them kids from hard places, that we're going to understand that there's a high likelihood that they're going to experience these things, whether because it's genetic or because of the lack of attachment that they had or the challenges with attachment that they had earlier, that these are very likely things. And so when we start seeing signs, things that seem out of the realm of what is typical, that we're pursuing interventions with them, right? And so as caregivers, maybe as grandparents who are here in the room, as folks who are part of the community, that you all are not going to be asked to treat these things, right? That you're going to be seeking out other professionals who have a great amount of experience in working with them, that you'll be working with different doctors and prescribing nurse practitioners and psychiatrists who are going to be able to help you figure out, is this a situation where medication would be beneficial because it would help reduce their symptoms enough to be able to carry out some kind of other treatment. So I think the biggest thing for you all is to just recognize that this is a real thing, right? That these symptoms, the behaviors that we see are not just because kids are acting out and because they're bad kids. I think that sometimes kids who are in foster care who have experienced trauma, maybe they're not even in foster care, but we see them around the community, right? They're in our schools, they may come to our churches, and they demonstrate some of these behaviors. And so our tendency then is to want to kind of put them into this category of, well, they weren't parented the right way, or, kind of making assessments about these kids instead of taking into consideration their context and what they've experienced and how it's affected their brain chemistry and all of these other things. So there really is that holistic piece to it, that we need to attend to this in many different ways. So I'm sorry to not answer your question more specifically. Okay, all right, well, good. I'll check that off. So oppositional defiance disorders. So in talking a little bit more about foster adoptive families, I think that we can see that it makes sense for these families who are taking in kids from hard places to start experiencing challenges in their home as well, right? This is a quote from Kristen Berry, and she has a website if you want to go to Confessions of an Adoptive Parent. And she, has podcasts and a lot of articles. She and her husband have both written books. And I really like the way that she describes it here. She says, as parents of children who've suffered trauma, we are now experiencing secondary trauma. Do you love a child who is hurting? Are you managing a schedule filled with doctors, counselors, and IEP meetings? Are you struggling with feelings of hopelessness and exhaustion? You are not alone. Let's face this secondary trauma together. I commit this week to finding someone to lean on. I will tell the truth about this feeling. I will let go of some of the emotional weight I carry. Will you? And so as she describes this, I think this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg of what it is that foster and adoptive parents experience, that it is this commitment to serving kids who have gone through really significant challenges in their lives. And so consequently, the people who are providing care from them are going to be firsthand experiencing that as well. And so because of that, there's a lot of different things that we can do to reach out and support foster and adoptive families. I know that that's a passion of the Gomez family to reach out and to be a support to other families who are in the process of doing this. I know that Project 127, a component of the training, is to have what's called support team training. And what that is it brings in the friends and family of the families who are going to foster, and it provides a training for them about trauma and what are some of the different things that you can expect when a child who's experienced trauma comes into the home. And the reason for that is because you want your community to be able to have an understanding of what it is that this child is experiencing. So that way we're less likely, again, to jump to drawing conclusions and assumptions about these kids and their behaviors, or about biological parents and having judgment for them as well. That we want the folks around us to have a comprehensive understanding of what the foster care system is and the ways that it is broken, and also the ways that we are able to step into it. And I'm so thankful for all of the advancements that have been made in terms of learning more about attachment and how to rebuild attachment for these kids. It's incredible the ways that people have been studying the brain and know that we really can improve that attachment for kids, that we really can make significant gains in meeting those different gaps that these children have, so that they can really take steps towards healing in the holistic way that I believe that God has intended. And so in that way, we're in a great time where there's a lot of developments being made. But even still, it's a lot to chew, right? And as people are maybe in here considering becoming foster or adoptive families, or you have somebody that you know who's considering being a foster or adoptive family, you have these different feelings that come up of, I don't know about getting into all of this, right? That this is a lot between navigating the system and all of the different dimensions that we've talked about tonight. It's a big piece to chew. But the reason that we believe that it's possible to do it is because there is that community support, that it's not that you're doing this alone. And also thinking about, if it's not us, then who, right? If it's not the church who's stepping up to take care of these kids and to support these biological parents and root for them and root for their success and recovery, then who's going to do it? That it's really what Christ has called us to do in caring for our neighbors. And so it really is that important. That we do have these resources then between doctors, between school systems who've been familiar with navigating these kinds of situations, with therapists, that you have a team of people in addition to your church community, in addition to your family community, that you can lean on as a team and that can help you with learning what are the best ways to meet the needs of this child. But you're still going to be wrestling, right? Because there's just, at the end of the day, you're on the front lines. These other folks meet with your child for an hour and then they go home. But that's your reality. That's your day in, day out, is caring for these kids who may be resisting the love that you're trying to show them, or maybe really grappling with depression to where they seem like they're in this dark space and you don't know how to help pull them out. And thankfully, because of that, they have a number of different support groups throughout the Denver metro area for foster and adoptive families. Many of those are through churches. If you want to go actually to the Project 127 website, they have a list of the different support groups throughout the Front Range. And that's a great opportunity for families to go and be raw and say the hard things out loud, that sometimes people feel like, I can't say this about my foster or adoptive child, or about my frustration with the system, because people don't understand what I'm talking about. They don't understand the intricacies of it, or they may think I'm a bad person who doesn't have sympathy and compassion and empathy. And so you're able to talk in a room with other foster and adoptive families who've gone through similar things and are able to understand and share their experience, as well as just kind of bringing it back to how is the Lord going to help sustain and help you endure these different things that are taking place within your home, within your family. One of the things I also really encourage to foster and adoptive families is counseling for themselves. That we're so focused on getting the kids counseling that moms and dads or siblings who are already in the home, that they're really struggling, but the focus is on this child and their needs. And so I am an advocate in recommending that you take the time to talk about how things are going with you, the way that it's affecting you to be relentlessly pursuing this child and pouring out this compassion even when it's really hard. Or for the biological kids, for them to be able to verbalize if there was a difficult placement that they had and how it affected them and how it affected the dynamics of their whole family. Because that's going to be helpful for them as well, to be able to find words to describe that and be able to work through feelings of resentment or confusion that they may have from just kind of the upheaval that comes from having another person come into the household with a lot of needs and challenges. So I think that all is important to consider as well for them. So we're going to take some time now, and I don't know, would you prefer to do question and answers before discussion, or would you rather do discussion time and then maybe formulate other questions? What feels better to you all? Discussion first? Okay, we'll do the discussion then. So if you want to take, we'll probably take about 15, 20 minutes for you to go through these questions at your table. And I also want for you, I mentioned, to kind of have conversation around biological parents and the slide that asks some questions about their barriers and maybe some of the things to consider regarding them. I also think that you can use this time to talk a little bit more about the video, that we didn't take time to debrief as a group because we kind of had to plug through some stuff, but to be able to just kind of talk more about what was that like for you to watch that video. I know that it was emotional and it brought up a lot of things for a lot of people, and so for you to be able to take a few minutes maybe as you're first getting started to talk about removed and then move on to the other questions. So we'll take about 20 minutes to do that right now.